You're standing at the foot of a mountain that looks like it's breathing. Smoke rolls down its face like a dark veil. Thunder cracks, not in the distance right over your head. A trumpet blast cuts through the air, long and rising, like the sky itself is calling everything to attention. Israel is gathered, not as tourists, as survivors. People who still taste Egypt in the back of their throats, who still remember bricks without straw, who watched a sea split and swallow an empire. And then the voice comes. Not Moses' voice, not a priest's voice. The text says God spoke all these words out loud, covenant words, the kind that don't float away after the echo fades. You've read them before. You can probably list a few from memory. Do not murder. Do not steal. Short lines, sharp edges. But in this moment, they don't land like isolated rules on a poster. They arrive in an order. First this, then that, like steps, like a path being laid down through the wilderness of a newly freed nation. And there's a tension most readers miss, hidden in plain sight. If these are covenant words, if they're spoken as a deliberate sequence, what happens when you treat them like disconnected slogans? Because the mountain is shaking, the people are trembling, and God is not merely handing out morals. He's forming a people, and the order might be the key you were never taught to look for. Here's what everyone gets wrong about the 10 Commandments. They're treated like 10 separate moral tips, or like 2 unrelated tables, as if God just stacked rules into a list and called it a day. But what the Bible actually teaches is subtler and far more unified. At Sinai, the commandments are covenant terms spoken in a sequence that moves somewhere. They begin with loyalty to the Lord, exclusive allegiance, true worship, truthful speech about His name. Then they anchor a community with sacred time and legitimate authority. And only then do they press outward into neighbor life, protecting life, marriage, property, reputation, and finally the desires that sabotage all of it. That means each commandment is a link in a chain. You're not meant to read, "You shall not murder," as a floating proverb. It grows out of a world where God has already claimed you. The neighbor commands don't replace the God commands. They express them, and suddenly Jesus' teaching stops sounding like a simplification. When He says the law hangs on 2 loves, love the Lord your God, and love your neighbor as yourself, He's not shrinking Sinai into a slogan. He's reading Sinai the way it was spoken. One unified covenant life, one integrated direction of the heart. In other words, Jesus treats them as one law because they already are one law. A single shape of faithfulness, covenant loyalty toward God that necessarily becomes neighbor love. So that scene you pictured, the mountain, the trumpet, the trembling, wasn't God tossing commandments like stones. It was God building a roadway. But to see the roadway, you have to stop asking, "Which rule did I break?" and start asking, "Where is this sequence taking me?" And that means going back into the covenant moment itself, and listening to the order as if you've never heard it before. The voice at Sinai doesn't begin with, "Try harder." It begins with identity. Before a single, "You shall not," Exodus frames the scene like a covenant ceremony. God brings them to Himself, calls them to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, and then speaks. That matters because in the ancient world, covenants weren't vague spiritual feelings. They were binding relationships. A great king would declare who he is, what he has done, and what loyalty now looks like. And the 10 Commandments follow that same logic. "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." That's not commandment number 0. That's the foundation under all 10. Redemption first, relationship first, then instruction. So when the first command says, "You shall have no other gods before me," it's not abstract monotheism. It's exclusive allegiance. In covenant language, you don't get multiple suzerains, multiple ultimate lords. The rest of the commandments are the lived-out shape of that loyalty. And that's why the order isn't random. The first movements guard the relationship at its most vulnerable points. Who you worship, how you speak about the God whose name you bear. Then the sequence stabilizes communal life with Sabbath and family honor because a redeemed people needs rhythms, authority, and continuity. Only after that does it move into the social fabric. Life, marriage, property, truth. It's like God is building outward from the center. The covenant claim comes first. Then the covenant culture grows around it. This is also why the commandments are called words, in Hebrew devarim asterisk, not merely laws. A asterisk devar asterisk is a spoken matter, a word that carries weight and creates reality. God speaks a people into being, and these 10 words become the grammar of their life with Him. And once you see them as covenant structure, you stop reading them like 10 independent fences. You start seeing a single boundary line drawn around an entire relationship. Which raises the next question. If the order is deliberate, what does each step actually target? Not just the English summary you memorized, but the force of the Hebrew itself, what it's really saying as it moves from Godward loyalty toward neighbor love. That sequence becomes clearer when you listen to each command the way an Israelite would hear it: short, direct, and stacked like stones in a path. First, no other gods before the Lord, meaning no rivals in His presence, no competing allegiances tolerated in the covenant space. Second, no carved image. Not because art is evil, but because worship is not yours to redesign. The invisible God refuses to be reduced, managed, or domesticated. Third, don't lift up the Lord's name for emptiness. The Hebrew word is shav. It means vanity, falsehood, worthlessness. God's name isn't a throwaway label. In Scripture, a name is identity and reputation. To carry His name lightly is to turn covenant into noise. Fourth, remember the Sabbath day to make it holy. Sabbath isn't just rest, it's trust. You stop producing because you're not Pharaoh's slave anymore. You imitate God's own rest, and your time itself becomes covenant-shaped. Fifth, honor father and mother. Notice the hinge. This is still about loyalty, but now it's embodied in human authority. A covenant people survives by receiving life, teaching, and identity across generations. Then the commands turn fully outward. Sixth, you shall not murder. Life is protected because humans bear God's image. Seventh, you shall not commit adultery. Marriage is guarded as a covenant within the covenant. Eighth, you shall not steal. Property and security matter because neighbor stability matters. Ninth, you shall not bear false witness. Justice collapses when words become weapons. And then the 10th command does something shocking. It doesn't say, don't take. It says, don't want. You shall not covet, not your neighbor's house, spouse, servants, animals. The law reaches beneath the visible act to the hidden desire. Because coveting is the root system feeding theft, adultery, even murder. It's the heart leaning inward, consuming what belongs to another. So the order intensifies. From worship, to time, to authority, to actions, and finally to the inner world that drives the actions. If you've ever wondered why Jesus can speak as if the whole law is one thing, this is where the text starts whispering the answer. Because the 10 Commandments don't merely restrict behavior. They map love beginning with God and ending in the human heart. You can feel the direction now, outward from God, into community, and finally into desire. But there's a pattern even tighter than God, then neighbor, and the last command is the key. Because coveting is not an extra sin tacked on at the end, it's the final turn of the knife that shows what the whole sequence has been aiming at. Watch the movement like a camera pull back. The first command: secure the covenant center. The Lord alone. Worship on His terms, His name not treated as empty sound. Then Sabbath and parents appear like pillars, time and authority, so the covenant doesn't stay mystical. It becomes lived, rhythm, continuity, a people who can actually endure. And then the commandments walk into the streets. Life, marriage, property, courtroom truth. These aren't random social issues. They're the necessary outward shape of loyalty to the God who liberated slaves and calls them to be holy. Neighbor commands are the covenant showing up in public. Now here's the hidden pattern inside the pattern. The commandments don't just move from God stuff to people stuff. They move from the visible to the invisible. From allegiance you can name, to actions you can prosecute, to desires no human court can even see. That's why the 10th command is so disruptive. It takes the same neighbor-centered language, your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, anything that is your neighbor's, and it says the problem can begin without a hand ever reaching out. The Hebrew verb for covet, chamad asterisk, is desire that fixates, desire that reaches. It's the heart leaning toward possession. And suddenly the earlier commands light up. Murder doesn't start with blood. Adultery doesn't start with a bed. Theft doesn't start with a lock being picked. False witness doesn't start in court. It starts when a heart decides truth is optional. So the 10 words end where they always intended to end. Not merely with public order. With interior allegiance. The sequence has been tracing one unified life. God at the center, neighbor protected at the edges, and the heart as the real battleground where covenant loyalty either holds or fractures. And if that's true, then Jesus' way of reading the law starts to feel less like a summary and more like an X-ray. Because when he talks about one law of love, he's pressing on the very logic that the 10th command exposes. The 10 commandments are not 10 disconnected bars in a moral cage. They're 10 covenant words spoken like a single sentence. The Lord claims what belongs to him: your worship, your trust, your speech, your time. Then he sets your life into a community where authority isn't despised, where life is protected, where faithfulness is guarded, where truth can stand in court without trembling. And just when you think the law is only about what can be seen, it arrives at the last command and turns the lamp inward. Because the deepest threat to covenant isn't merely what hands do, it's what hearts want. That's why Jesus can speak of the law as one unified command without shrinking it. He's hearing the 10 words as they were meant to be heard. Love for God that necessarily becomes love for neighbor, and love for neighbor that exposes whether love for God is real. Sinai wasn't God handing out fragments. It was God drawing the contours of a people who would bear his name in the world, people whose worship and justice match, whose prayers and relationships don't contradict each other. And when you read the commandments in their order, you don't just learn rules. You see a portrait, a way of being whole. If this kind of hidden in plain sight pattern opened the text for you, there's more to uncover, more places where Scripture's structure is preaching before a single verse is explained. Staying connected by subscribing means you'll keep getting these deep, text-grounded walks through the Bible, one surprising thread at a time.